There we go. So, guys, gals, we've been talking about the physiology of the respiratory system. We look at the physiology of its functional side. So when we think of the functions of the respiratory system, the single biggest function is going to be gas exchange across the membrane. We need to get oxygen gas delivered to the bloodstream. We need to get carbon dioxide gas removed from the bloodstream. Depending on where this is happening, whether it's in the lungs or if it's going to be in the deep tissues of the body, the gases are going to move different directions. The direction our gas moves is always going to be dependent upon the concentration gradients. So if we look within our lungs, inside of the alveoli of our lungs, let's go with purple here. Actually, let's go with green. Here we go. We have lots of oxygen gas because we just breathed it in. So we have a super high concentration of oxygen gas in the alveoli of our lungs. That blood that's being delivered to the lungs has a lower concentration of oxygen. Therefore, oxygen is going to diffuse towards the blood, and vice versa. The blood being sent to the lungs has a high concentration of carbon dioxide, usually in the form of bicarbonate ion. And that carbon dioxide will preferentially diffuse into the alveoli to be exhaled. So CO2 leaves the blood and goes to the alveoli. Now, this gas exchange process is going to be dependent upon a couple things. One is the concentration gradient. If we are breathing in pure oxygen gas, we've maxed out the concentration gradient of oxygen, and we're going to maximize the amount of oxygen that we load onto our erythrocytes, or red blood cells. There's a couple situations where we'll want to do that. We'll talk about that in a couple slides. Some other situations you might run into are maybe you're rebreathing. So I have a 3-year-old who wakes up with night terrors all the time. And I'll walk into the room, and he'll be hiding under his blanket. And he'll be screaming and going, "Dad!" Happened twice last night. And as I walk into the room, I notice while he's under the blanket, he's breathing in and out very rapidly. His respiratory rhythm is elevated. And one of the reasons for that is he's rebreathing his breath, his carbon dioxide that he's been exhaling, and his exhalant, the stuff that comes out of his mouth, doesn't have as much oxygen gas in it. So to compensate for the reduced oxygen concentration, he accelerates his respiratory rhythm to try to deliver even more oxygen to his bloodstream. Now, as we're looking at this loading and unloading of the erythrocytes, another factor is time. A common student misconception is that it's instantaneous, because why wouldn't it be instantaneous? They're little tiny atoms, molecules. They don't need to move that far. But the reality of the situation is it takes time for this little gas molecule to diffuse across a membrane and then bind to a hemoglobin or bind to a carboxylase enzyme, or to go across a membrane and get into the lungs and be exhaled. And this physical time, this physical distance, usually takes about a quarter second. So our erythrocytes need to spend a little in the lungs in order for the gas exchange to occur with our hemoglobin. Now, thankfully, when we're at rest, there's plenty of time. Our erythrocytes spend about 3/4 of a second in the alveoli capillaries, or the alveolar capillary bed. And then when we're really huffing and pumping and we have an elevated heart rate, they still typically are going to spend over a quarter second. The figure cited in your textbook is 1/3 of a second, approximately. I'm not necessarily hung up on these exact numbers, 0.25, 0.75, 0.3. What I want you to focus on is the overall trend, that it takes a little bit of time, some fraction of a second, for the gases to load and unload. And as we exercise more, the blood has less time for loading and unloading of the gases. The erythrocytes have less available time. But even if we're really exercising really hard, there's still enough time for the loading and unloading of these gases. Something else that is kind of confusing for individuals is that these gases behave independently of each other. These gas concentrations don't directly influence one or the other one. There are some indirect influences, but they're pretty convoluted. So we're just going to say they behave independently of each other. An oxygen gradient influences only oxygen diffusion, and the carbon dioxide gradient will influence just the carbon dioxide diffusion. Now, when we look at these gradients that we have, generally speaking, in the alveolar air, the air that we breathe into the lungs, and let's back up a couple slides here. When we breathe in, we're inhaling air, inspiring. That air is about 21% oxygen. And if we look at partial pressures, and we have 760 milliliters of mercury for atmospheric pressure, 20% of that gives us an atmospheric partial pressure of about 159 millimeters of mercury, assuming nothing weird has happened. But something weird has happened to that air that we're breathing in. We've warmed it up and caused it to expand. And as we expand the air and warm the air, we also are going to add more water to it. So we're changing the overall percentage of oxygen in it as we condition the air with the warm, moist membranes of our upper respiratory tract. And by the time it gets to our alveoli, the partial pressure of oxygen has declined just a little bit. It still has a lot of oxygen. So the air coming into our lungs has a high concentration of oxygen, and then the blood entering the lungs has a low concentration of oxygen. We have about 100 millimeters of mercury versus 40 millimeters of mercury. So air is going to diffuse into the bloodstream and bind to the hemoglobin. And then the converse is true for our blood. With carbon dioxide. The blood has a slightly higher concentration of carbon dioxide relative to the air, so we're preferentially going to add carbon dioxide to the air within our alveoli. Occasionally, we'll run into situations where we need to give somebody high pressure purified air, or high pressure, high concentrations of oxygen. And this is known as hyperbaric oxygen therapy. The idea behind this is that you force the concentration gradient of oxygen to be artificially elevated to artificially inflate the rate of diffusion of oxygen. And some situations where you want to really inflate the rate of diffusion typically are going to be, really the most common one we run into today is carbon monoxide poisoning. And we'll talk more about that one in a little bit. Gangrene is less common today, thank goodness, because it's disgusting and terrifying all at the same time. These are situations where we need to pump more oxygen into the body, either because there's a lack of circulation. Gangrene is associated with a lack of circulation. So we have a problem delivering our circulatory system because we don't have the vessels in place. When we look at carbon monoxide poisoning, our erythrocytes have been, for lack of a better term, partially deactivated. It's known as competitive inhibition, where carbon monoxide binds to the heme subunit really tightly, and to get that carbon dioxide off so our red blood cells can transport oxygen instead of carbon monoxide, we have to radically increase the concentration gradient of oxygen. Occasionally in high altitude situations, there'll be something known as altitude sickness, where somebody is suffering from a lower or depressed oxygen concentration within their bloodstream. And it takes a while for them to acclimate, and we'll talk about some of the ways they acclimate in subsequent slides. Let's talk about how gases diffuse and get into the fluids and into our bodies. Solubility is a big component of this. Thankfully, both carbon monoxide and oxygen are small, non-polar molecules that can go through a phospholipid bilayer readily. As we're looking at carbon dioxide in particular, though, it is very soluble within water. This is interesting in that when we can take carbon dioxide, and pump it into water and dissolve it into water quite readily in carbonate beverages. And you've all seen that. We take a pop can or a pop bottle, and you shake it up, and you agitate it so it releases the carbon dioxide that's been dissolved. Those bubbles are carbon dioxide gas, not oxygen gas. And part of the reason that carbon dioxide is so much more soluble within the body or within water is because there's some mild dipole moments associated with it. There's some very mild unevenness associated with this electronegativity, of course, it's across the molecule, which allows it to preferentially be dissolved in water relative to oxygen, which has equal electronegativities across this entire molecule. Another key factor is the thickness of the membrane. A thin membrane is less of a barrier compared to a thick membrane. So if we have normal, healthy alveoli, those normal, healthy alveoli have a simple squamous epithelium. It's intact and it's thin, and those gases can travel directly across that membrane easily. Occasionally, somebody is going to have mucus build up in their lungs, or fluid build up in their lungs. If it's the buildup of mucus, we call that pneumonia. More specifically, it's mucus that has something growing in it, usually bacteria, occasionally viruses. Or it could be fluid building up in the alveoli. In that case, we call it edema of the lungs, pulmonary edema. In either situation, we have fluid buildup that reduces the rate of diffusion, and we also are going to have a thickening of the alveolar walls, which also reduces the rate of diffusion. Another key feature here is the surface area of our membrane. Bigger membranes can have more diffusion compared to smaller membranes. It's kind of like, you know, a big door versus a small door. We can fit more people through a double door than we can through a single door in the same amount of time. Within our bodies, there's a lot of adaptations to maximize surface area. We'll talk about the intestinal system in our next unit. With the lungs in particular, we're looking at about 70 square meters of surface area within the lungs of an average healthy adult. To give that some perspective, 70 square meters-ish is about the surface area of this entire lower level of this lecture hall, or the first story of a normal, farmhouse, or 1,500 square foot farmhouse. So it's a lot of surface area squeezed into a really small space. And because we have such a high surface area, we can have what seems like instantaneous oxygenation of our blood as it moves through our lungs. Some things that reduce surface area include lung cancer, as we have tumors build up in the lungs. Emphysema is one that we talked about in lab that also reduces surface area. On this photomicrograph on the screen, we have alveoli of someone with emphysema. And instead of having continuous walls to their alveoli, the alveolar walls have been fragmented. And there's a reduction in surface area, in addition to the reduction in elasticity of the lungs. This next idea is called ventilation-perfusion coupling, and the idea behind this is that our body is constantly adjusting respiration rates, or the respiratory rhythms, and is also going to be constantly adjusting flow rates of the pulmonary circuit. So if we need to get more oxygen or get rid of more carbon dioxide, we tend to breathe a little bit heavier. If we have too much oxygen or too much carbon dioxide going to the lungs, we'll tend to send more blood to the lungs to help account for those gas concentrations. So we'll camp on this slide for a little bit. So let's say we look at the blood flow first. The key or take-home idea is blood flow and airflow will always equalize with each other. So I'm putting a sideways equal sign right here. Blood flow and airflow equalize with each other, depending on relative concentrations. So with our blood flow, let's say we have decreased airflow. For whatever reason, you're not breathing as much. In response to decreased airflow, maybe holding your breath, the body responds by having decreased blood flow to the lungs. The cardiac rhythm and cardiac output is reduced. If you start breathing in and out really fast, you have increased airflow, there's going to be a temporary increase in blood flow that correlates with that increase in airflow. So blood flow and airflow equalize with each other. And the same can be said with the other end of the spectrum. So if instead of changing our breathing in and breathing out, if our heart change its cardiac output. Maybe we have sympathetic versus parasympathetic activation. Our respiratory rhythm will adjust in response. They both are at a dynamic equilibrium to equalize the rate of gas exchange within our bodies. Let's look at gas transport. I emphasized this earlier. It's worth emphasizing again. Oxygen is bound to hemoglobin. When we move oxygen gas throughout our systemic and pulmonary circuits, that oxygen molecule is bound to hemoglobin. Each hemoglobin has 4 hemes, and each heme can hold 1 oxygen molecule. In other words, 1 hemoglobin can hold up to 4 oxygen molecules. The vast majority of oxygen will not be dissolved in the plasma. There's an almost inconsequential amount of oxygen in our blood plasma. Overwhelmingly, oxygen will be transported on the hemoglobin. On the other end of the spectrum, we have carbon dioxide. This gas is overwhelmingly transported in the blood plasma. A lot of students think that erythrocytes, or red blood cells, transport both oxygen and carbon dioxide equally, and that's a misnomer. The carbon dioxide is processed in the erythrocytes, but once the erythrocyte is done processing the carbon dioxide, it's a secondary form. And the reason we need to convert carbon dioxide into a secondary form is one very important reason. We don't like having bubbles in our bloodstream. Bubbles in the blood are not good. Some of you maybe are certified scuba divers. I had an opportunity when I was in college for a coral reef class, and one of the big things they really emphasize during scuba training is that if you go down really deep in the water, you don't surface instantaneously, because that causes nitrogen bubbles to form in the bloodstream. You get a condition known as the bends, and those bubbles, float up in the blood, and they'll float up to the brain. You have big bubbles trapped in the blood vessels of the brain. They cut off blood supply to the brain, and first you are really happy and delusional, and then you pass out, and then you die. That's usually the 3-step plan when you have bubbles in your blood. So if we had carbon dioxide dissolved in our bloodstream, it's just gas, kind of like soda pop. The moment you jump down, you would agitate that gas out of solution, and kind of like a pop bottle fizzing over, your bloodstream would fizz over, and you'd be filled with bubbles, and you'd kick the bucket. So we needed a way to get carbon dioxide moved around in our bodies without killing ourselves from carbon dioxide bubbles. And we do this by taking the carbon dioxide and turning it into a bicarbonate ion. So the overwhelming majority of carbon dioxide will enter into a red blood cell. While it's in a red blood cell, it's converted to carbonic acid, and then that carbonic acid dissociates into a hydrogen and bicarbonate ion, and the bicarbonate ion will then be dissolved in the bloodstream, in the blood plasma directly. There is a little bit of carbon dioxide dissolved in the blood as a gas, a tiny fraction, and a tiny bit of carbon dioxide also binds to proteins, about a 5% concentration or volume of carbon dioxide. Question? It does, yes. The more carbon dioxide we have in our bodies means that bloodstream means we'll have more carbonic acid. The more carbonic acid we make means the more hydrogen ions, or the more acidic our bloodstream becomes. So if we hold our breath and we stop exhaling the carbon dioxide, that carbon dioxide builds up in our bodies, and we start to acidify our bloodstream as a result. On the other hand, when somebody's hyperventilating and they're exhaling more carbon dioxide than they're producing metabolically, their blood becomes alkaline or basic in response, or their pH becomes elevated above baseline. So another way to think of this is you can change your blood pH by breathing in and breathing out to really distill it down to its bare minimum. On this slide here, we have a hemoglobin molecule in the upper right. This is an adult hemoglobin with 2 beta and 2 alpha subunits. And we can carry a lot of oxygen in our bloodstream with these hemoglobins, quite a bit, about 20 mils of oxygen gas per deciliter. Or another way of thinking of this is we can transport about 100 milliliters, excuse me, 200 milliliters of oxygen in 1 liter of blood. So there's a good amount of oxygen we can move around. Now within hemoglobin, we have the 4 subunits, the 4 globular subunits, and then in yellow, we have 4 heme molecules in the center. And in the center of those 4 hemes, we'll have 1 iron atom in the center of each. And that iron atom is what binds to the oxygen gas. It's also what binds to the carbon monoxide as well during carbon monoxide poisoning. And chemically speaking, that iron carbon monoxide bond chemically is much stronger than the iron oxygen gas bond. So carbon monoxide preferentially displaces oxygen and renders hemoglobin unable to bind to oxygen, just because of bond strength comparisons. The abbreviation for hemoglobin is HB. Hemoglobin bound to an oxygen molecule is called HbO2. And since we talk about it a lot, it's nice to have an abbreviation to simplify our diagrams. We also have deoxyhemoglobin. That's a hemoglobin molecule with no oxygen present. Those deoxyhemoglobins are, instead of having an oxygen, will have a hydrogen ion. So deoxyhemoglobin will have an HHB as its abbreviation. Now, as this carbon dioxide is moving around in our bodies, there's 3 primary ways that we can transport it. I've already mentioned them 2 slides ago, but it's worth re-emphasizing. We have carbon dioxide gas directly being dissolved in the bloodstream, just a little tiny bit, a smidge. We also are going to have carbon dioxide turned into carbonic acid inside of our erythrocytes. And then carbonic acid dissociates into a hydrogen ion and a bicarbonate, or hydrogen carbonate ion. You really need to memorize this equation. This is standard practice, and this is one of the most important chemical equations in our bodies. It's not quite as important as the cellular respiration equation that talks about sugar and oxygen making water and carbon dioxide. That's probably more important. But this one is the blood pH equation. This is the equation that buffers our bloodstream, that helps to regulate our blood's pH and help us to maintain homeostasis. I remember in particular, I was a sophomore, I was a sophomore in college at the time, when I was learning about buffering systems, and it really rocked my world, because up until that point, everything was very binary. It was an acid or it was a base, one or the other. The idea that a molecule could be both acidic and basic was very confusing for me. And it's all about relative comparisons. When we look at this mixture, we have the bicarbonate ion and we have the hydrogen ion. And this buffering system that maintains or resists changes in blood pH works this way. Let's say I add some kind of a basic chemical to my bloodstream. For whatever reason, I'm eating a lot of base. Maybe I had lutefisk for dinner or something of that nature. That lutefisk is going to introduce a lot of hydroxide ions. And for those of you who don't know, lutefisk is decomposing fish mixed with Drano. It's a cultural thing. The hydroxide ions from that lutefisk would bind to the hydrogen ions and be neutralized. So instead of the lutefisk instantaneously making our blood more alkaline, there would be a period in time where it would be removing hydrogen ions from the bloodstream to neutralize the hydroxide ions. This solution resists the change. It will eventually change pH, but it takes a little bit longer because of the buffering properties. And now let's say, instead of lutefisk, I'm drinking way too much coffee, way more than is good for me. I'm adding an extra hydrogen ions to my bloodstream. Those hydrogen ions preferentially bind to the negative bicarbonate and are neutralized. And in that way, this chemical equation helps to moderate or reduce fluctuations in pH. Instead of having our pH fluctuate wildly, we have a more gradual fluctuation in blood pH. Now, as we're looking at the carbon dioxide in this equation, I'm going to modify it quickly for us right here. We should really have double arrows in the middle. And the reason we should really have double arrows is that depending on the situation, this reaction could go either direction. In our lungs, where we don't have a lot of carbon dioxide, in our alveoli, the equation overwhelmingly goes this direction, towards the production of carbon dioxide, because we're getting rid of carbon dioxide from our bodies, and the low concentration of carbon dioxide gas drives the equation towards the production of carbon dioxide. And then in our body tissues, where we have our cells pumping out lots and lots of carbon dioxide, we have a high concentration of carbon dioxide in your big toe, far away from your lungs. The chemical equation is driven this direction to produce more bicarbonate or hydrogen ions. It all depends on the relative concentrations of the gases in our bodies. Now, when we look at the carbon dioxide that binds to proteins, occasionally it will bind to hemoglobin. That's known as a carboaminohemoglobin, abbreviated as an HbCO2. This is a vast minority of the carbon dioxide transported in our bodies. So yes, technically our red blood cells do transport carbon dioxide gas directly. Carbon dioxide can very, very slightly bind to hemoglobin, but it's such a small fraction that we just don't pay that much attention to it. We're overwhelmingly going to be focused on the bicarbonate ions in the bloodstream. If somebody has too much carbon monoxide in their bloodstream, that carbon monoxide is going to displace oxygen. This is known as competitive inhibition. This process is going to cause the CO to bind to the hemoglobin and displace oxygen gas. This process is kind of nefarious because carbon monoxide is colorless and odorless and diffuses very rapidly throughout the air. Usually, carbon monoxide is going to be produced by incomplete combustion. So most of the times, it's going to be an old furnace or an old water heater in somebody's home that has a dirty burner or bad air supply to the burning element. And instead of having bright blue flames associated with complete combustion, they instead have incomplete combustion and will have the dirty orange-yellow flames. Another big clue that there's incomplete combustion in your furnace or your water heater is there's soot buildup. And if there's soot building up in the vent pipe or maybe on the chimney, that soot means that not everything is being burned. So those are the two red flags to look out for. The symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning are that dizziness, as we have lack of oxygen, drowsiness, because we aren't delivering oxygen to our brain, and disorientation. A lot of times we'll have false alarms with carbon monoxide poisoning. Some of the newer smoke detectors are both carbon monoxide and particulate smoke detectors built into one, and they'll be networked in a home, hardwired to each other. And I remember very specifically in a home I owned, they were malfunctioning, and it was like 3 in the morning. And all the alarms in my house went off at the same time, and they were saying, warning, carbon monoxide poisoning, warning, evacuate immediately, in this really anal-sounding computerized voice. And I'm sitting there going, it's the middle of the summer, my furnace is off. Why is there carbon monoxide poisoning? Or why, I just couldn't figure it out. But at the same time, in the back of my head, I was thinking, okay, disorientation and drowsiness are symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning. So I was going back and forth. Am I disoriented and drowsy because I'm being killed right now? Or am I disoriented and drowsy because of my stupid alarms going off at 3 in the morning? As it turns out, it was a stupid alarm issue. I decided to split the difference. I opened up all the windows in my house, killed the power to the circuit breaker, and went back to bed. And then the next day, I started ripping them off the ceiling and replaced them with separate standalone units that were not networked. Where's I going with this? Oh, carbon monoxide poisoning. Carbon monoxide binds, yeah, I had some rage associated with that. Carbon monoxide binds really tightly to the hemoglobin, and it makes it appear bright red. So for those of you who maybe end up in a forensic science setting or some kind of a pathology lab, a giant symptom of carbon monoxide is going to be this erythema, or bright red superficial tissue on the corpse, post-mortem. So on the screen you can see there's a corpse, part of a corpse on a stretcher. I cropped it off to remove the private parts. But there's this splotchy, bright red coloration all over the body. And that's a key symptom of carbon monoxide poisoning, or death from carbon monoxide. And in case you didn't need another reason to not smoke, smoking causes lots of carbon monoxide to build up in your bloodstream from the incomplete combustion of whatever the heck it is you're smoking. Let's see here. Let's talk about systemic unloading. So we talked about in the lungs, pulmonary unloading. In the lungs, oxygen is sent to the bloodstream, and then carbon monoxide is sent to the alveoli. We have the reverse in the body tissues, in the systemic circuit. In this circuit, we're going to send oxygen gas to the tissues, to the cells directly. A lot of students think, incorrectly, it's a common misconception, that the oxygen gas molecule will instantaneously transport from the hemoglobin to inside of the cytoplasm of the cell that needs it. That's not correct. There are multiple membranes and multiple fluid cavities that the oxygen gas molecule needs to go through. So this oxygen gas molecule starts on a hemoglobin in a red blood cell. It dissociates, goes into the plasma of the red blood cell. Then it crosses the cell membrane into the blood plasma. From the blood plasma, that oxygen molecule needs to go across the membrane of the tunica intima to get into the extracellular cavity, or the interstitial fluid. From the interstitial fluid, the liquid outside of the cells of our body, that oxygen gas molecule then has to go across the cell membrane of the target cell to get into the cytoplasm of the target cell. So there's multiple membranes and multiple fluid cavities involved. Now, as the cells of our body go through lots of cellular respiration, we're going to take that sugar and turn it into carbon dioxide, preferentially in the citric acid cycle, where we make most of our carbon dioxide. And then from the inside of the mitochondria, that carbon dioxide molecule is going to work its way across membranes, across the double membrane of the mitochondria, across the cell membrane to the extracellular fluid, across the tunica intima membrane, into the blood plasma, and from the blood plasma, that carbon dioxide gets into the red blood cell. Once it's in the red blood cell, there's an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. Carbonic anhydrase catalyzes this step of the reaction, this step of the double arrow. So that depending on relative concentrations, if there's a ton of carbon dioxide gas, carbonic anhydrase will turn it into carbonic acid. And then in our lungs, where we have hardly any carbon dioxide gas, or lowered carbon dioxide gas, carbonic anhydrase turns carbonic acid into carbon dioxide gas. So it's a reversible reaction that goes back and forth. It's catalyzed or sped up by this particular enzyme. So I know this is kind of hard to see on the screen, on the figure. For those of you that printed it off, hopefully it's easier to see on your printout. We're going to focus on this reaction arrow. Carbon dioxide gets into the bloodstream. It binds to the water. Carbonic anhydrase turns it into carbonic acid. Carbonic acid will immediately dissociate into the hydrogen and bicarbonate ions. The bicarbonate ions need to get out of the red blood cell. Too many bicarbonates in the red blood cell are going to throw off the pH and the homeostasis of the inside of the red blood cell. Now, there's a problem, and that problem is resting membrane potential. All cells in our body have a resting membrane potential. We just don't care about most of the resting membrane potentials because they remain stationary and never are altered. Electrically active cells like muscular cells and neurons in the nervous system, we spend lots of time talking about because those voltages fluctuate. In our bodies, for the erythrocytes, there's a baseline voltage across the membrane, and we need to maintain that at a constant voltage. So as we remove a -1 bicarbonate ion and get rid of it, we need to gain a -1 ion to keep the membrane voltage constant. And this is known as the chloride shift. The removal of one bicarbonate ion from the erythrocyte is coupled with the addition of one chloride ion to the erythrocyte. So we lose a -1 bicarbonate and gain a -1 chloride in order to maintain resting membrane potential within our erythrocytes. That extra hydrogen ion that was produced as the bicarbonate acid or carbonic acid dissociates will then bind to a hemoglobin within the erythrocyte. So let's talk about loading and unloading of oxygen. As we are changing oxygen concentrations in our body, that influences the direction that oxygen will travel, the loading and unloading of oxygen. We also find that hydrogen ions, the pH of our body, influences oxygen loading and unloading. As we add more hydrogen ions or remove hydrogen ions, they bind to the side chain residue of amino acids and change if they're polar or non-polar, and that changes the shape of the hemoglobin. And if you change the shape of the hemoglobin, if you change its structure, you change its function. So a change of pH directly causes proteins to change shape and then cause proteins to have an altered functionality. So as we change the concentrations of hydrogen ions in our bloodstream from our lungs to our big toe and then back again, this is going to influence how well hemoglobin is attracted to oxygen molecules. And we find that the more hydrogen ions we have, the more likely we are to let go of the oxygen molecules. And this is a good thing. The part of our body that has lots of hydrogen ions is going to be the really far away from your lungs. This is going to be the part of the body that has too much carbon dioxide. So as carbon dioxide concentrations go up, hydrogen ions concentrations go up, and as we have more hydrogen ions, that makes us more likely to add oxygen to whatever tissue we're looking at the time from the hemoglobin. When we look at the oxyhemoglobin, within our systemic capillaries, it arrives almost fully loaded. It's not uncommon to have over 95% concentration of our oxygen, or a PO2 level of 95% or higher. We're not going to talk about pulse oximeters. They're a fun side distraction. There's some cool spectrometry involved with pulse oximeters. Needless to say, the blood arriving to the tissues has a lot of oxygen. And then as it leaves our tissues, it has less oxygen. It's given the oxygen up to our bloodstream, or excuse me, to the tissues of our body. There's still some residual oxygen in our deoxygenated blood. I'll say that again. Deoxygenated blood still has a lot of oxygen in it. It's just less oxygen. This leftover oxygen in our venous blood is known as the venous reserve. We typically deliver about 22% of our oxygen the first go around as we circulate the blood throughout our body, throughout our systemic circuit. So when we hold our breath, one of the things we start to utilize is our venous reserve. Even though we're not inhaling more oxygen gas, we have backup oxygen already built into our bloodstreams. Let's look at the alveoli. Spend some time looking at the chloride shift in the systemic circuit as we have systemic gas exchange. this reaction mechanism is in reverse in the lungs. So during alveolar gas exchange, we need to take a bicarbonate ion that's been transported in the blood plasma and breathe it out. And that's a problem because ions typically aren't going to be in a gaseous state. Gaseous states are known as plasmas. So think of like lightning, flame, fluorescent light bulbs, or stars. Those are plasmas. And we don't exhale plasma, the fourth state of matter. We exhale carbon dioxide gas. So we need to find a way to take this carbon dioxide, this ion that preferentially likes to be dissolved in liquid, and find a way to dissolve it in a gaseous solution in the air we exhale. And we go through a reverse chloride shift. So I'm going to go from the bottom of the slide up to follow the reaction mechanism from start to finish. We'll start with a bicarbonate ion in our blood plasma. And in this situation, in our lungs, there's low carbon dioxide. So the reaction mechanism, that bicarbonate buffering system that we had the equation for, is being driven towards carbon dioxide gas. The bicarbonate ion crosses the plasma membrane, or the erythrocytes. And as we add a negative ion to the red blood cell, we have to subtract a negative chloride ion to maintain resting membrane potential. Once in the cell, that bicarbonate ion will then preferentially bind to a hydrogen ion that was being transported on a deoxyhemoglobin. And the hydrogen ion plus the bicarbonate ion forms carbonic acid. Carbonic acid then will almost instantaneously, we're looking at attoseconds, so basically instantaneously, will be converted to carbon dioxide by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. Excuse me. That carbonic anhydrase takes the carbonic acid, converts it into a water molecule, carbon dioxide, and the carbon dioxide then diffuses across the membranes and through the fluid compartments to get into the lungs, where we eventually exhale it out of the lungs. We can adjust our ability to transport gases based on changes to our metabolism and changes to our surrounding environment. One of the things that we find is that the relative concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere, ambient partial pressure of oxygen, or ambient PO2, is going to change our ability to keep oxygen stuck on a hemoglobin molecule. When we're in situations where there's low oxygen or low PO2, hemoglobin goes through a conformational shift that causes it to preferentially unload oxygen. As oxygen molecules bind to a hemoglobin, that new chemical bond that's formed changes the shape of hemoglobin just a little bit. And that slight change in shape causes there to be a slight change in the functionality of hemoglobin. In low oxygen environments, hemoglobin starts to lose oxygen molecules. And the loss of those oxygen molecules changes the shape of hemoglobin in a way that makes it less likely to hang on to oxygen molecules. So in other words, another way of phrasing it is, in low oxygen environments, hemoglobin changes to unload as much oxygen as possible. Our venous reserve of oxygen is decreased. And that's represented by this inflection point on our graph. And then this is a pH graph, but the curve for oxygen concentration looks the same. It's the whoop kind of a curve associated with the titration. And the inflection point right here in the middle corresponds to 2 oxygens on the hemoglobin. So there's 2 oxygen molecules attached. Hemoglobin is equally likely to load or unload oxygen. Once there's 1 oxygen molecule attached, hemoglobin is very, very likely to get rid of its single remaining oxygen. On the other hand, if there's 3 oxygens attached to hemoglobin, hemoglobin is pretty likely to hang on to its 3 oxygens. It's not very likely to unload the oxygen, and instead has a higher affinity for oxygen. Something else is going to be the pH. This is known as the Bohr effect officially, but just generally speaking, the pH of our blood plasma. As we have more hydrogen ions binding to hemoglobin, our hemoglobin changes shape in such a way that it's more likely to unload oxygen, because more hydrogen ions is directly correlated with increased carbon dioxide concentrations. So if we look at normal blood pH, 7.35 to 7.45, or 7.4 to split the difference. We have the blue curve. And if we become acidic, we have excess hydrogen ions building up in our bloodstream. This represents the red line, and we're more likely to dump the oxygen off our erythrocytes. In situations where we have not enough hydrogen ions or not enough carbon dioxide, you've been hyperventilating, for example, your bloodstream is less likely to unload the oxygen, and you're more likely to hang on to the oxygen, and that's represented by that upper green curve. Another big one is temperature. Both directly and indirectly. Proteins change shape in response to changing temperatures. This is one of the reasons why cooking food kills bacteria. You cause the proteins that keep the bacteria alive to change shape so radically that the bacteria cease to live. Another reason cooking food is good for us is we take tough, fibrous proteins, cook them, change their shape, and make it juicy and tender instead. Another thing that is associated with pH is temperature, is the ability for a gas to be dissolved in a liquid. There's a reason why we like drinking cold beer, cold soda pop, cold carbonated beverages. As the temperature of a fluid goes down, the solubility of a gas goes up, and vice versa. As a liquid becomes warmer, a liquid is less likely to have a gas dissolved in it. As we look at this curve up here, 10 degrees Celsius is associated with high oxygen saturation. And we're able to very effectively store oxygen gas onto the hemoglobin. On the flip side, if we have a raging fever at 43 degrees Celsius, so that would be 2, 4, 6, 8. That's like 106 degrees Fahrenheit, 107 degrees Fahrenheit. You'd probably be unconscious at this point. You have a very tough time oxygenating your blood or binding oxygen to the hemoglobin. Another factor that influences the loading and unloading of these gases is a secondary protein known as bisphosphoglycerate. Bisphosphoglycerate, or BPG, is a protein we produce in response to oxygen concentrations. As we have elevated or decreased concentrations of oxygen in our body, we are going to activate or deactivate different genes within our nuclei and transcribe and translate different proteins. One of these proteins is the one that produces bisphosphoglycerate. As we make more bisphosphoglycerate, that bisphosphoglycerate binds to the center of the 4 globular proteins within the hemoglobin. And the binding of bisphosphoglycerate to the center of a hemoglobin molecule causes that molecule to change shape just a little bit in such a way that it's very likely to unload all of its oxygen gas molecules. We stimulate the production of bisphosphoglycerate when we have low oxygen environments, or if we have elevated body temperature, elevated thyroid hormone, constantly being stressed out. There's lots of different ways that we can upregulate the transcription and translation of proteins that make bisphosphoglycerate. Let's talk about arterial blood. Arterial blood is the blood we care about the most because that's the blood that delivers the goods. That's the blood that sends oxygen to the tissues that need the oxygen. We're very fixated on the supply side of our cardiovascular system. Arterial blood has a pH range of 7.35 to 7.45. So there's some room for fluctuation within that dynamic equilibrium or homeostatic balance. All blood should be alkaline because all blood in the human being should have a pH of above 7. So by definition, blood should be alkaline or basic in a healthy human. Within this bloodstream, or this homeostatic blood, partial pressures of carbon dioxide are 40 millimeters of mercury, and oxygen gas are approximately 95 millimeters of mercury. In other words, they pretty much mirror the alveolar gas partial pressures. And we have different parts of our bodies constantly monitoring blood pH, blood gas concentrations, blood temperature. We have blood pressure receptors. We have chemoreceptors and baroreceptors. We're constantly monitoring the chemistry of our blood to help maintain homeostasis. Some of those receptors are located within the central nervous system, and they monitor the cerebral spinal fluid. Other receptors are within the peripheral nervous system, and they're going to directly monitor the blood chemistry. Of all the chemical signals we care about, pH is the single most important for regulating our respiratory rhythm. A lot of textbooks will simplify things and say carbon dioxide, but if we really wanted to be pedantic, it's not the carbon dioxide, but it's the hydrogen ions that are released by carbonic acid that cause the most damage or cause the biggest change in protein shape. So as we add more hydrogen ions or remove hydrogen ions from solution, we cause those side chain residues of amino acids to go from polar to nonpolar, and that dramatically is going to alter the shape of the protein. So we care the most about blood pH, and that's going to be the single most potent factor that regulates our respiratory rhythm. After pH, carbon dioxide concentrations are the second most potent, and then after carbon dioxide, surprisingly, oxygen is the least significant. This is one of the reasons why swim coaches tell their athletes to not hyperventilate before they jump in the pool to start swimming laps. Yes, turning your head to the side to breathe can slow your cadence and maybe slow you down a little bit, but the dangerous aspect of intentionally hyperventilating before you swim laps is that you artificially lower blood carbon dioxide concentrations, you artificially elevate blood pH, but you really don't change blood oxygen concentrations. And in those situations, because blood carbon dioxide and blood oxygen have been altered, but not, blood carbon dioxide and blood pH have been altered, but not blood oxygen, people that hyperventilate before they swim laps are at risk of passing out while they're swimming laps because they run out of oxygen before the pH or carbon dioxide signals trigger them to breathe. We mentioned this before, how we have pulmonary ventilation and pulmonary circulation adjusted dynamically to maintain homeostasis with each other. We're also going to adjust pulmonary ventilation to maintain pH. If we have too many hydrogen ions in our blood, the immediate response of our body is to breathe more. Inhale, exhale more. And as we're inhaling and exhaling more, we are going to exhale more carbon dioxide. Getting rid of that carbon dioxide causes carbonic acid to be reduced. And as we reduce carbonic acid concentrations, we reduce hydrogen ion concentrations within the blood. So the more we inhale and exhale, the more we are going to raise the pH of the blood and lower hydrogen ion concentrations. Hyperventilation causes alkalosis, causes our blood to become more alkaline. Within our body, the central nervous system, the brain, is the most important organ of our bodies. So in terms of response to specific chemoreceptors, central chemoreceptors trigger a bigger response compared to chemoreceptors of the peripheral nervous system that trigger less of a response to our respiratory rhythm. So all blood is alkaline. I need to repeat that again. All blood is alkaline. But if you raise blood above the homeostatic baseline, if you raise the blood pH, we call that alkalosis, a blood pH higher than 7.45. If the blood pH is lower than 7.35, we call that acidosis. In one situation, with acidosis, we have too many hydrogen ions. With alkalosis, we don't have enough hydrogen ions. A condition in our body where we have too much carbon dioxide is called hypercapnia. Hypercapnia will, in almost every situation, hypocapnia is too little carbon dioxide. When we have too little carbon dioxide, hypocapnia, that will almost in every situation lead to alkalosis of the blood. The less carbon dioxide we have, the less carbonic acid, the more alkaline our blood becomes. And the reverse is true with hypercapnia. If we have too much carbon dioxide, we make too much carbonic acid, and then have too many hydrogen ions in solution. So we have acidosis set in. When we look at hypercapnia and hypocapnia, there's two different ways we can have those induced. We can change our respiratory rhythm, or we could change our metabolic output, or our metabolic balance. So we can have respiratory acidosis, or we can have metabolic acidosis. Respiratory acidosis is holding your breath too long. And because of a change to your respiratory rhythm, you have too much acid lead up into the bloodstream. Metabolic acidosis is going to be the production of too much carbon dioxide, producing carbon dioxide faster than you can exhale it. So depending on if it's a ventilation or a production issue, we call it respiratory versus metabolic, alkalosis or acidosis. So as we look at respiratory acidosis and respiratory alkalosis, that's breathing too much or breathing too little. Hyperventilation is breathing too much. During hyperventilation, we blow off too much carbon dioxide. We artificially lower carbonic acid concentrations and consequently have an elevated pH. Our blood becomes alkaline. The pH goes above 7.45. So when we're hyperventilating, we drive the reaction to the left, so to speak, because we're getting rid of lots of carbon dioxide. Don't quote me on this. It's been a while since I took OChem, but I believe the principle here is called Chatelier's principle, the idea of changing relative chemical concentrations within a reversible reaction. So in this situation, if we artificially lower carbon dioxide concentrations, we drive the reaction to the left and get rid of hydrogen ions. If we're holding our breath or not breathing enough, we're artificially elevating carbon dioxide concentrations. That shifts the reaction to the right, and we can add more acid to the bloodstream. We lower the blood pH in those situations. So if we have blood alkalosis, if our blood is too basic, the first initial response is going to be to not breathe in and out as much, and we'll artificially upregulate carbon dioxide concentrations. Oh, that's frustrating. Hold on a second here. Having slides cut off like that is really irritating. So come on, load. Here we go. I'm just shifting over to Google Drive right now. Respiratory physiology, instructor. My problem was I took a file from Drive, exported it from Drive, and had to import to Top Hat. That was a no-go. I should have gone directly from PowerPoint to Top Hat. Now I know. Yeah, the one with the P on it. There we go. Now that's frustrating. Okay, So never mind. Apparently, it's not even better looking in Google Drive. That's okay. So let's talk about ketoacidosis. There's more than one way to acidify your bloodstream. You can hold your breath, or you can make too many acidic molecules and dump those acidic molecules into the bloodstream from the cells of your body. Ketoacidosis is a condition associated with rapid weight loss. When somebody is rapidly losing weight, they are going to take fat molecules through a metabolic reaction series known as beta oxidation, which you really didn't talk about last semester because we didn't have time to. And this beta oxidative pathway will take a triglyceride molecule, chop it up into a glycerol and 3 fatty acids. Every fat molecule we break down is going to turn into 3 acidic molecules that have carbonic acid groups or carboxylic acid functional groups on them. And it's those carboxylic acid functional groups that are going to preferentially acidify the bloodstream as we are breaking down fat. And to process these functional groups on these fatty acids, we turn them into ketone molecules, hence the phrase ketoacidosis. We have an elevation in ketone concentration as we have a lowering or an acidification of the blood pH. There is a side reaction associated with this. The processing of these fatty acids and turning them into ketones will result in a molecule known as acetone. That one, fingernail polish remover, the good stuff, not that protein-based stuff that's terrible. Or it's also used as well. So as we're making this molecule, our breath starts to smell like fingernail polish remover. And a key symptom associated with ketoacidosis is the fruity or aromatic breath smell. When somebody exhales near you and you go, whoa, what was that? If it smells like an organic solvent, they're probably experiencing ketoacidosis, metabolically speaking. So, as we look at carbon dioxide, we're going to come back to carbon dioxide because it's so important for monitoring our blood pH. Indirectly, carbon dioxide concentrations change blood pH. As we have an increase in carbon dioxide, we have a decrease in the pH. But that's indirect. A direct effect is that carbon dioxide concentrations are monitored directly in the bloodstream. As we have more carbon dioxide increases the rate of respiratory rhythm. So as we have a higher concentration of carbon dioxide, that directly causes us to breathe in and out more. And as we're looking at these processes, carbon dioxide preferentially builds up in the body, not the central nervous system. So the peripheral chemoreceptors are more likely to respond to a change in carbon dioxide concentration relative to the central nervous system chemoreceptors. Because with the central nervous system, we have the blood-brain barrier, and then we have cerebral spinal fluid, and the fluctuation of carbon dioxide concentration is relative to the carbon dioxide concentration in the bloodstream. Oxygen gas isn't really that significant. I mean, eventually, yes, a lack of oxygen will cause you to breathe in and out more. If somebody has chronic hypoxemia, so chronically low blood oxygen concentrations, there's several things they'll do. First, they'll make more erythropoietin, so they have more red blood cells being made, and they'll have polycythemia set in. But if polycythemia is not enough, if they still are suffering from chronically low blood oxygen concentrations, eventually hypoxic drive sets in. This hypoxic drive is breathing in and out faster because of low oxygen, not elevated carbon dioxide or low pH. Chronic hypoxia is associated with emphysema and pneumonia, 2 diseases we spent a lot of time talking about during lab, or at least we did with emphysema. With emphysema and pneumonia, the rate of oxygen exchange across that membrane is dramatically reduced. Now, individuals that have emphysema or pneumonia, generally speaking, are pretty sedentary. So they're not going to be producing lots of carbon dioxide because they feel terrible and they're sitting in a chair all the time. I mean, who wants to exercise when you have pneumonia? I don't. But they still have their basal metabolic rate. They still need to consume oxygen at a certain baseline level to keep their brain functioning. And it's the lack of oxygen that drives the elevated respiratory rhythm for these individuals, not an excessive amount of carbon dioxide. Something else that can cause us to have an elevated respiratory rhythm is thinking about exercising. Just the thought of exercise causes us to breathe in and out more. There's some truth to watching somebody else exercise. Now, it's not as good as the real thing, because when you do the real thing, you're also burning more ATP. Watching somebody else exercise, thinking about other people exercise or yourself exercising just makes you have an elevated respiratory rhythm. It doesn't elevate the consumption of ATP, which is really what you go for with exercise most of the time if you're trying to do it for weight loss. So just the anticipation of exercising causes our brainstem to automatically increase the ventilation rate in anticipation of a change in homeostasis. And then we have exercising directly. There were some really cool studies involved where volunteers were put in on a plinth or a big padded table, and then the researchers took them and just wiggled their joints back and forth. So they activated the proprioceptors of the volunteers without causing the volunteers to actually do the work. So they were moving their body without exercising. And they found that just the movement of the body causes an elevated respiratory rhythm. So thinking about exercise causes you to breathe more. Moving your body more causes you to breathe more. These are two ways that you can adjust your blood chemistry in anticipation of the metabolic demands of actual exercise. When we look at hypoxia, that lack of the oxygen in the bloodstream, we can have hypoxemic hypoxia. This is a variety, or one way we can have a lack of oxygen in the bloodstream. This is going to be a chronically low PO2 level. Hypoxemic hypoxia is going to be associated with inadequate pulmonary gas exchange. So in these situations, either there's a disease state, maybe pneumonia, maybe emphysema, maybe they're at high altitudes and there's just not a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere to go around. We can also have ischemic hypoxia. Ischemic hypoxia isn't necessarily going to be associated with the pulmonary exchange, but instead is going to be associated with the circulation of blood. So in these situations, the lungs are functioning all right. It's the heart's ability to move the oxygen around the cardiovascular system that's causing the problem. And it can either be from the heart directly, or we can have an obstructive disease blocking the blood vessels. We also have anemic hypoxia. Anemic hypoxia is from a lack of hemoglobin in our bloodstream for binding oxygen. We can have histologic hypoxia. This could be carbon monoxide poisoning, for example, or cyanide poisoning, the reduction of the ability to utilize the oxygen. All of these hypoxic states are going to cause extremities to turn blue. You've seen this at the swimming pool with that little boy or little girl that weighs maybe 20 pounds soaking wet, and their lips are blue, their fingers are blue, and they're shivering like crazy, but they don't want to leave the pool because they're having too much fun. And every time I talk about cyanosis, I think of Mr. Smurf. The guy I have up on the screen is named Paul Carsan, and I thought this was just too cool not to share. His skin is blue not because of hypoxia. His skin is blue because he drank colloidal silver every day as a health supplement that he thought would purify and cleanse his body. And as he had the silver concentrations build up in his body, the silver reacted with the carbohydrates within his skin, and silver ions plus carbohydrate ions turn deep dark blue. And his skin has been permanently stained blue as a result of that, drinking colloidal silver every day for a couple years. For those of you who are interested in theater history or stage history, I guess the term we call it now is blackface. Back then, they just called it makeup. But they would take a silver nitrate solution and rub it on the surface of your skin, and the carbohydrates on the surface of your skin would be stained deep, deep dark blue and look almost black in appearance as an alternative to henna. We have oxygen imbalances in our body that can cause some side effects. Some of the side effects associated with too much oxygen are going to be degeneration of the enzymes in our bodies. Excessive oxygen concentrations are going to cause there to be excessive peroxide and superoxide concentrations, or too many free radicals building up in our bodies. And these free radicals that are generated from too much oxygen will ultimately cause things to break down as chemical bonds, covalent bonds between our proteins and our other macromolecules are ripped apart. We can have hyperbaric oxygen given to somebody who temporarily, for a short period of time, benefits from elevated oxygen concentrations, but this is not done frequently anymore because of the oxygen toxicity side effects. And I was really hoping to get into diseases of the respiratory system, but we have 2 minutes left in class, and this is a really good stopping point before we get to the diseases. So, because I didn't get to cover our diseases before our exam, there will be no diseases of the respiratory system on the exam, because I'm not going to test you on something I didn't cover during class. With that said, I'd still like it if you read about them. It's kind of nice to know about the different kinds of lung cancers out there, or how marijuana has more carcinogens than tobacco smoke. All right, that's it for class. See you Tuesday.